My name is Juan Felipe Vallejo. Welcome to Applied Innovation. I'd like to invite the people in the back to come forward and grab a seat. Thank you for joining our Lunch and Learn series. We have a great speaker, a great guest today is Fred Haney. And Fred, our topic is going to be the Fundable startup. So he's going to be discussing with you effective strategies to get your startup funded. Is the microphone on? Fred Haney, Ph.D., has been actively involved in the creation of high-tech businesses from 6 different perspectives. As co-founder and chairman, an active director of over 20 companies, a mentor, angel investor, venture capital fund manager, and as a corporate strategic planning executive. Fred served as the founding chairman of Novodyne Therapeutics, DRC, Media Matchmaker, and Pulse Sentry. At Novodyne and DRC, he managed strategies that led to the Series A infusion of over $25 million in venture capital. Haney has also been a hands-on director of many high-tech startup companies, 4 of which were public companies, including Rainbow Technologies. Fred has also played a founding role in establishing entrepreneurial networks such as Monday Club and the Tecos Angels. The Monday Club is a large mentoring network that helps companies improve their business strategy and operations. And the Tecos Angels is one of the largest angel investment groups in the United States. Fred received a Ph.D. degree in computer science from Carnegie Mellon University, an MS in mathematics from Colorado State University, and a BA in mathematics from Ohio Wesleyan University. So before we welcome Fred, we want to also thank our sponsors, Fledling Attorneys at Law, for all their fantastic support. So please let me welcome Fred Haney.
Thank you, Juan. It's nice to be back at UCI. I say back because when I first came to California, which was a long time ago, I got a call from a gentleman named Julian Feldman, who headed up the computer science department at that time. And he was a PhD graduate of my PhD school, Carnegie Mellon. So he called me up and asked if I would come down and teach a class part-time. So I did that for 4 or 5 years. I was a teacher. My other connection to UCI is that my son is an anteater, proud anteater. And my other confession is that my daughter is a banana slug. So the Fundable startup, we're going to talk about what it takes to get money into startup companies. It's a book that I got boxes of the day before yesterday. Its official publication date is actually not until February 6th. But we're going to talk a little bit about the behind the scenes. And by the time we're all done here, you'll know all about it and you won't have to buy it. One thing I want to set context a little bit here, because what I'm saying probably doesn't apply to all startups. The subtitle is How Disruptive Companies Attract Capital. By disruptive, I mean companies that make really radical changes in the world. You know, they solve a problem that hasn't been solved before, or they create a new market by coming up with a product that has not been developed before. Or maybe they just have a way of doing something 100 times better than it's ever been done before. But they make a big change, and the implication is that they have the potential to be a really large company. I mean, some of the VCs would say, we want to see $1 billion revenue potential on annual revenue. That's pretty aggressive. Not many VCs have seen companies do that in a 5-year period of time. The more conservative ones might say 100 million in revenue over a 5-year period of time, ask them how many times they've seen that happen, and the answer is probably not very many, but that's the goal. That's the hurdle rate that they're trying to accomplish. And I'm using technology in a very broad sense here. When I say high tech, I don't just mean computer chips. I mean anything that's based on science, invention, patents, technologies. So that could include biotechnology and healthcare. It's a very broad use of the phrase. What are you guys up to? I mean, have some of you been involved with startup companies in the past? Have you managed a startup or been a part of one? Hands up. Wow. How about today? How many of you are involved with a startup today and trying to make something happen? So good. How many put your hands up both times? Did it, doing it. That's even better. Good. So here are some of the things we're going to talk about today. There are themes that I want to weave together as we go. One is, if you're going to approach investors to try and fund your startup, you need to have a pretty good idea about how investors think. We're going to talk about strategies for attracting capital to your startup. I'm using the word attracting with intent. The idea here is if you do the right things, the money will come to you. You don't have to go begging for it. So that's what we mean when we say attracting capital. We'll talk a little about leadership for startups and who makes the best leaders for a startup. We're also going to talk about careers and how they evolve. Careers evolve in funny ways. My preference is for careers that evolve in gradual, sort of step-by-step process, so that you're always learning, always doing something you like, always moving a little bit forward, never take a big leap off a cliff. My career, if you saw the bio there, I could not have predicted where I would end up. Like when I graduated from college, I would have thought I'd spend the rest of my life writing computer programs or solving math puzzles or something. And if you had told me that I was going to end up running a venture capital fund and doing some high-tech startups, I'd have just laughed. I wouldn't have been able to predict that. And yet, there was never a great leap in my career. Every step kind of followed naturally from things I had done before. There were probably some early indications in my life that I was destined to do some kind of office work. There also might have been some early indications in my life that I had some latent leadership qualities. But you just don't know where it's going. And part of my message is that careers need to evolve in kind of a careful way. I went to four different schools at different times. So I met my wife, Barbara, who's sitting back there, at Ohio Wesleyan University. So I have an anteater, a banana slug, and we're both battling bishops. And then we got married on Saturday and graduated from Ohio Wesleyan on Sunday and moved to Colorado on Monday for some time, 2 years at Colorado State University. And then we spent a year in Providence at Brown University. And I was very happy at Brown until the head of the computer science lab told me that computers would be dead within 5 years. So I picked up the telephone and said, Carnegie Mellon, this is Fred. Remember me? I turned down a fellowship last year. I'd like to reapply. So I transferred to Carnegie Mellon and finished up my Ph.D. in computer science at a time when it was kind of hard to find official computer science programs. And then early career was large companies. I had 4 summer internships with IBM. I came California after Carnegie Mellon. I came out here to work for Scientific Data Systems, again, managing large software development projects. That was kind of the sweet spot of my training, complex problem solving, big systems, software kind of stuff. But then Xerox bought Scientific Data Systems and turned me into more of a product planner, corporate planner, strategic planner. I spent almost 15 years in corporate planning, some of it at Xerox, some of it at Computer Sciences Corporation, some of it at TRW. At TRW, I was involved with the planning for several divisions, but I also got asked to sell a division of TRW. That was Data Point. It was a marketing division for Data Point computer products around the world. And I put a big chunk of money, it was like $114 million worth of cash after-tax profit on TRW's book. I helped put it there with some other people one year. And then I had an opportunity to run a division of TRW, smaller, and I did that for about a year and a half, got it profitable and sold it to another company. So I had some pretty good managerial experience. One of the takeaways from my experience at TRW was here I was in my very early 40s running a division of TRW, and I kind of looked around at all the other division managers, and I thought, holy cow, these guys are all 15 or 20 years older than I am. Do I really want to wait 15 or 20 years for an opportunity to do this again? So about that time, an executive recruiter came to me and he said, Fred, you've been doing a lot of the things that the venture capital people do. The only difference I can really see is they're probably making a little more money than you are. Would you want to think about that? So I did a little networking and I got introduced to 3i Group, which is a large British bank consortium. And they recruited me to set up and run a high-tech venture capital fund, California-style high-tech venture capital fund, headquartered for California in Fashion Island, just a couple miles from here. So I did that for almost 9 years. But there was no great leap there. I mean, I went from software development to venture capital without flying off a bridge. I mean, every step of the way, I was kind of enjoying what I was doing. I was learning something. I was advancing a little bit. So at 3i, I managed a six-man team. I built a six-man venture capital team, but I also had a portfolio of companies, and I won't bore you with all of them, but Sierra Semiconductor was one of my investments. They did quite well. A company called IC Sensors made the little accelerometer that decides when to release a crash bag. It makes an instantaneous decision. Whoa, was that a fast stop or did we just hit a fire plug? And do we need to release the crash bag? And a couple other very interesting and very successful companies that I dealt with. One of the takeaway lessons from that experience was that out of those 12 companies, I ended up replacing 6 of the CEOs. It didn't happen all at once. This was spread over a 9-year period of time. And it wasn't me kind of charging in with a chip on my shoulder. It was me gently going to the other members of the board of directors, the non-executive members of the board, and saying, am I the only person who's upset with the way things are happening here? We've missed some goals. We've had some problems. We've talked about it. Things still haven't gotten any better. And in every case, I got kind of a resounding me too. And we ended up forming a committee and going out and recruiting another CEO. So I've had to think a lot about, what kind of skills and background does it take to run a startup company successfully. I have done a separate little talk called The Many Hats a Venture Capitalist Wears. There's about a dozen different hats. I actually have the hats, so I can kind of go through the hats. But this is just a little sampler from that. The green eye shade is obvious. VCs are expected to be financial analysts. The yellow hard hat, that's what you put on when you're trying to replace one CEO with another. And general problem solving requires that. You're expected to be kind of mystical. That's the reason for the wizard's hat there. And it seems like no matter how much of a gentleman you try to be, somebody's going to end up thinking you're a vulture capitalist. So I had to have a vulture capital hat too. My career then evolved to the venture management company, which started out as a consulting business, but then it became more of a sweat equity practice, kind of helping launch some startup companies. Monday Club, some of you are members of Monday Club. That's a group that I started when I was running 3i Ventures. Originally, it started as a little sidecar fund, a way of pulling some top entrepreneurs and CEOs and service providers to early stage high-tech companies. So we had about 15 people initially, but when I left 3i in the early 90s, we changed the model to having a couple companies come in once a month and present their business plan. And the idea was to just give them feedback. We weren't trying to be an investor group. We were just trying to give them a lot of feedback and help them improve their chances of getting funded. And, oh, by the way, maybe meet somebody who could help out, serve as a director or something like that. Monday Club now has 3 chapters. There's the largest is Orange County. It also meets in Torrance, and it also meets in Santa Monica. And total of about 950 people. Well, we don't have 300 people at every meeting. I mean, it's usually 25 or 30 people here in Orange County and 15 or 20 at the other venues. But we've helped a lot of companies. I mean, down through the years, we've probably worked with 500 or 600 different companies. And I was one of the 10 co-founders of the Tech Coast Angels that worked with Luis Villalobos. He really organized that. But I support his activity and served on the the initial board of governors for about 7 years. Part of the reason that there are 2 reasons that I wanted to share my personal background with you a little bit. One is to sort of emphasize the point that careers are kind of unpredictable and that you can get from one place to another without really leaping off a bridge, taking a giant leap. And the other is to begin to lead in a little bit to the implications of that when you start thinking about funding a startup. The little medals at the bottom are a couple nice awards I've had along the way from the Forum for Corporate Directors and the American Electronics Association. So I like what I call the karma career path approach. It just means your stuff sticks to you. The good things you do, the things you learn, kind of stay with you, and you can build on them as long as you're enjoying what you're doing and learning and advancing. You're probably on a good career path. These kind of career paths make me nervous. Now, why am I saying that here? Because that's what I see sometimes when people who have spent their whole life in a laboratory come up with a business idea and they say, okay, I'm going to go do this. I'm going to go play Steve Jobs. He did it. I can do it. This is what happens so often. And that's part of what inspired me to write the book. I just see an awful lot of startups fail. And there are a lot of different reasons that they fail, but one of the themes is sometimes people try to do things that they just don't have the background and experience to do. One of my little departures along the way was to write a book about the golden retriever that we owned in 2006. It was called My Doggie Says. It's a collection of color photographs that kind of explain doggy behavior, communication. What I was trying to do was capture Jamie, in this case, golden retriever, sending me a message, and my challenge was to try and figure out, well, what's the message? What's she trying to tell me? I know she's trying to tell me something. Well, what is it? And how do I decipher this? So I learned a lot trying about not just dog body language, but also about how they think and communicate. That led to a 4-year stint as the host of the My Doggie Says radio talk show, which was live in Phoenix for an hour every week, and I had a lot of great guests. And then we lost Jamie, and she was replaced by Callie, whom you see here in the picture. That's a little clip from a video of Callie and me playing soccer. We spend 20 or 30 minutes every evening playing soccer in our backyard. She whacks it off her nose. It's not really a soccer ball. It's kind of an underinflated rubber ball that looks like a soccer ball. Anyway, it was a detour in my career, but it wasn't really a detour because so much of my career has been about communicating, and that's one of the secrets to building successful startups. is telling your story in a clear and comfortable way. So, there was a lot of focus on communicating and public speaking, and hosting the radio talk show was a good thing for me to do. So I'm coming at this whole business of creating startups from half a dozen different perspectives, and each one probably has brought some different lessons. The venture capital business, I've helped start a handful of startups. I've served on a lot of boards. I hesitate to put the number down because I'm not sure I could count them all up, but a lot. The Monday Club, we've done a lot of mentoring. We've worked with a lot of companies and helped them move forward. My life in corporate planning actually carries over kind of nicely into the startup business. There's a real place for planning methodology in startups, and it helps to know something about that. And finally, having been an angel investor and lost a few bucks here and there, I've learned probably even more about some of the pitfalls and how to avoid them. So what problem is the book trying to solve? I'm really trying to help people improve their chances of getting funded, obviously improve their chances of being successful. But for a lot, what stands between the startup and success is often capital. And there are long lists of reasons. You can go Google on the internet and find long lists of reasons that companies fail. And there probably are a lot of different reasons. To me, an awful lot of them kind of translate to money problems. They either didn't get any money, or they got a little and it wasn't enough, or they burnt through it too fast, or they got plenty, but they spent it way too fast. It's the three piggy bank scenarios here. If you look at the long lists that people make of how companies fail, it includes things like take advice from the wrong people, didn't raise enough money, raised too much money, didn't talk to the lawyers enough, didn't talk to the accountants enough. But to me, all those kind of translate back to either didn't have enough money to really make it work, or didn't properly manage the money that they did have, and got into problems. My takeaway from those long lists of reasons companies fail is it's really hard to predict. There's no textbook that you can follow that says here are all the pitfalls you have to avoid. Failure is like a snake in the grass. I mean, it's just there and it jumps up and bites you. I've seen companies fail for unpredictable reasons. I mean, because they tried to be really clever about how to capitalize a company and didn't realize they were running afoul of the IRS. Needed to go talk to their accountant a little more and talk to lawyers a little more. But it's stuff like that that can kind of sneak up and bite you if you don't have enough of the right kind of experience on your team. It's gotten harder, in my opinion, to access capital for startups. In the 1970s, 1980s, there was a pretty robust venture capital industry all around the country. California represented about half of it, and Silicon Valley represented, 3/4 or 80% of California. But there were some large firms and some small firms. At that time, a large firm was probably managing $125 or $150 million in capital. There were some smaller funds that were managing 25, 50, 75, those kinds of amounts. And then a thing called Black Monday happened. It was October 19th, 1987. I hope we're not having a Black Friday here. The market's taken a big hit today. But on Black Monday, the market took a huge dip. And it basically shut down the IPO market for about 4 years. So the venture capitalists had no way of getting their money back. They couldn't get out of their deals. I got caught in that. My 3i Ventures portfolio, we were fortunate that we were deep pockets investors, so we were able to keep putting money in to support our companies. But as a result of that, the smaller funds basically got driven out of business. I mean, they didn't have enough capital to keep protecting their interests. And the other thing that happened is that the gatekeeper advisors who tell large corporations and people like CalPERS and Lacera where to put their money, those guys are all looking at the same handicap charts. I mean, they know who the really top guys are. They can see the list. You know, it's Kleiner Perkins and Sequoia and IVP and NEA and mostly Silicon Valley firms. So they were channeling all the money toward those guys. So it was a rich get richer, poor get poorer kind of situation. In my view, it's continued. It got even amplified after the dot-com bubble. It was kind of more of the same. You know, the smaller funds got driven out of business. The bigger funds got more money. So now we've got a situation where the larger venture capital funds are managing $1 billion, and there aren't very many small ones. The small ones that there are not the real high-quality, experienced ones for the most part. I'm sure there's exceptions. But if you're managing $500 million or $1 billion, you're going to have a hard time doing a whole lot of $500,000 seed deals with startup companies. You know, it just doesn't compute. You've got to spread that money across 30, 40, 50 deals or something like that. So it can't, the math just doesn't work to do a whole lot of real early stage investments. One of the things that prompted me to write the Fundable Startup was an article I read by a gentleman named James Kwok in Atlantic. And he quotes Steve Jobs' law. I think he's the only person who's ever called it Steve Jobs' law, but he defined Steve Jobs' law as saying founders make the best leaders. Steve Jobs can afford to say that. But the reality of the situation is, if you approach a venture capitalist like this guy you see on the screen, he's got 50 or 100 investment opportunities on his desk. And some of them are really good disruptive ideas like we talked about earlier. And some of them are managed by track record management teams, CEOs who have done it before. They've got credentials. They've got support teams that have a lot of history and have previous success. And that's the competition that you're having to deal with. If your background, again, refer back to my little off-the-cliff career chart, if you're coming from a background where you haven't really had management experience, you're in a very tough competitive situation, and you are having to compete against teams like the one on the right there that have done it before and have previous success. So the only safe assumption you can make when you approach at least venture capital investors is that you're having to compete with really good ideas and management teams that have some previous success and really good resumes. You'd be surprised how easy it is for a VC to determine if he's talking to an experienced CEO or an inexperienced CEO. This is kind of a busy chart, and I'm not going to talk all of these, but just to make the point. When someone says to a VC, we don't have any competition, what he hears is, we have no clue how to assess competition within our industry. Everybody has competition. I mean, if nothing else, you're competing against the way the problem is being solved today. But a lot of startups assume, well, there's nobody else is making exactly the same widget to the same specs we're making it, so we don't have any competition. Wrong. You know, there are probably other ways of solving the problem. That's what you're competing against, and an experienced CEO understands that and puts together a pretty good story about competition within his industry. one of my favorites is, well, we really only need 1% of the market because the market's so big that 1% will make us a $100 million business. What a VC hears is, you don't understand how profit works. You don't understand how market share works. The profitable companies within an industry segment are usually ones that have 20 or 30 or 40% market share. So if you're telling me you're going to be a 1% player, I'm not interested. Probably what a more experienced CEO would do is narrow that market definition, narrow it down, and show the investor the segment in which he could be a 20 or 30% player. I could go through the list, but you get the point. There are a lot of little signals that people send when they haven't been around these kind of problems before and don't know quite what the VCs are really looking for. Here's another part of the logic. I mean, there's a logic here that says you're having to compete against experienced management teams. And how did they get the way they are? You know, what's really involved, for example, in being the CEO of a company? Well, there's a long laundry list of skills that are necessary to be a really good CEO. And oh, by the way, just to make it worse, there are also a lot of what I call company building skills that are completely different from running a large division of a large company. I mean, go to a vice president at IBM, for example, and ask him how many times he started with a blank piece of paper and trying to figure out how to divvy up the shares between 6 members of a founding team. They haven't had that experience. You know, they may have good CEO skills in a large company context, but they don't necessarily know how to handle the situations that arise in a startup. So it's important to understand what a laundry list of skills is involved, both from the management point of view and also from the company building side. So one of the things that we do in the Fundable startup is give a couple examples of people who climbed the corporate ladder. It's really hard to find people at the CEO level in meaningful corporations who didn't spend at least 15 years getting there, if not 20. So I interviewed a couple people that I've known for some time who did a great job of climbing the corporate ladder. Van Honeycutt started as at the sales level doing some technical support kind of work, and over a period of time climbed his way to chairman of Computer Sciences Corporation. It didn't happen overnight. I mean, there was a lot of steps there, and it's an interesting case study because you can see him kind of learning one step at a time. Someone else a lot of you probably know is Webb Castor. He's a member of our Monday Club group. And Webb started at the ground level in IBM, then became part of Xerox. He worked his way up, not to the chairman or CEO of Xerox, but to the top sales position in the Xerox Corporation. So it's important to understand how involved growth can be in a career and the kinds of steps that it takes to achieve those kind of levels. We talked a little about this earlier. The subtitle of the Fundable startup is how disruptive companies attract capital. And again, the idea is that investors are in the business of finding good deals. I mean, they're managing, the VCs at least, are managing other people's money. They're not going to do anything stupid, at least not knowingly. They're in the business of trying to go out and find the best deals. So create one. I mean, that's the whole secret here, is create a really attractive investment opportunity, kind of knowing the kinds of things that the VCs are looking for. So what's the answer? It's chapter 12. And the answer is it's bootstrapping. I mean, everybody kind of knows that. But the answer is to be as creative as you possibly can about moving your company as far along as you can down the path, create as much value, build as much momentum, reduce as much risk as you possibly can before you go to investors. So you use a little bit of equity to recruit an implementation team, perhaps. You try and create a product or at least a prototype. You get some customers if you can. And that helps you attract some more people to your team, maybe some more experienced and seasoned people. The more of those kinds of things you can do before you approach investors, the better. Now, I know you're going to say, but how do I do that? It takes money to hire people. You know, I can't get people without the money. I can't get the money without the people. Terrible chicken and egg problem. Well, startups are just fraught with chicken and egg problems. You have to kind of work your way through it. But most of the successful startups have done some version of this. And the way they cut through the we don't have any money problem is they use their stock. And the other way they cut through it is they don't go out and hire vice presidents on day one. You don't need a bunch of rich vice presidents sitting in expensive offices on day one of your startup. What you need is some coders and some guys who know how to use a soldering iron. You know, build something. Go out and build something and see if you can sell it and get some positive feedback from some customers. Startups are obviously about taking dreams to the market. Every startup starts with a dream. A couple examples that we talk about in the book are DRC Computer and Novodyne Therapeutics. DRC is an interesting example because it really underscores one of the points I'm making about the kind of management that really helps you get a company going. I'm trying not to be hoarse. DRC was started by a guy who probably understood computer hardware and software, about the combination about as well as anybody on the planet. And he had the idea that they really should be interchangeable and that he should be able to make a computer that could be completely re-architected. I mean, the whole architecture of the computer changed on the fly. So if you're a techie and you want to know who would care about that, well, if you wanted to tell your computer all of a sudden you wanted to pipeline 100,000 things in parallel, you could do it on his machine. So it's sort of a stepping stone from field programmable gate arrays, to be a little technical about it. But he got this company up and running and had maybe 10 or 12 employees. And this would have been in the time frame early 90s, I guess, and approached venture capitalists over and over and over and just couldn't attract capital to the company. I was on his board for a couple of years, and I kept telling him, look, Steve, the problem is you just don't have the kind of management background that the VCs would really like to have in the company. He said, well, I want to run the company. I'm the only guy who knows how to do this. When the dot-com bubble burst, he burst. He lost his contracts. He lost his employees. And I went to him and said, Steve, I think we can build a company, but we're going to have to bring someone in that the VCs are happy to back. He said, fine, we'll do what we have to do. And it took us a while, but we found a guy who had been the chief operating officer of one of the top Silicon Valley chip companies. And it was a long, complicated thing, but we got him to come and just work for stock for a while until we were able to go out and raise, we started out with $7 million of venture capital, and we ended up building the company, getting the product out there. It's today, as far as I know, still ranked as the fastest gene sequencing computer on the planet. It was acquired some years back. Another similar story was Novodyne Therapeutics. Dr. Jack Edwards spent 25, probably now 35 years of his life inventing a fungal vaccine. It was a vaccine originally for candidiasis infections, but it turned out to also work for staph infections. And his dream was to get that fungal vaccine as the first fungal vaccine into people in clinical trials, to test. But he had he headed up infectious diseases department at Los Angeles Biomedical Research Institute, and he had a team of very technical people. They didn't have the business skills. So I worked with him for a while, and after 4 or 5 years, we were able to raise some venture capital. But my deal with the VCs, whom I knew, my deal with the VCs was, I've kind of brought this thing along so far, but as soon as we get some money in the bank, I'm going to step away, and we're going to call in one of the executive recruiter firms and recruit a top CEO from the industry. The VCs were happy with that. I mean, that worked fine. And part of the trick there was that we couldn't have recruited that guy. We couldn't have got the same CEO before we got the money. I mean, it's this, how do you get the money without the CEO? How do you get the CEO without the money? Well, we found a way to sort of build a bridge to the kind of CEO that the VCs were looking for, and that worked fine. Another one that followed the model that I outlined a minute ago is a company called LiveSafe. This was founded by a couple brothers on the East Coast, and it's up and running. You can find them online. They had the idea, they said, look, if someone's walking down the street and they see a crime being committed, what do? Well, they take a picture with their cell phone and post it on their Facebook page. Oh, thank you very much. Wouldn't it be nice if they could send that picture to the 911 and get some instant response? So they created that app, and they developed a back-end system that would be required within police departments. And they got a lot of early on national publicity. They did what we said. They used some stock to attract an implementation team. They got the product built, prototype. They got the system built. They were both kind of early working versions. They solved a couple interesting cases. They got some national publicity. They were on evening television around the country a couple times. And eventually were able, because of that, they were able to raise, I think they started out with about $800,000 worth of angel money. And then Barry Diller's venture capital firm, IAC, put in $5 million, and then Fred Smith, founder of FedEx, put in $5 million. But it was this very gradual, at pretty good valuations, by the way. So the key was that they moved it pretty far along before they even approached those first angel investors. Here's a local one that I know some of you are probably involved with. You may be investors or involved in other ways. But Laurie Torres had the idea of building a system that would solve the problem of packages just piling up in the lobby of big apartment complexes. They didn't really have a way to manage that problem. FedEx, UPS, Post Office, everybody would bring packages in and just kind of throw them in a pile, and then the residents would have to come and unsort it. Well, Laurie built a system of electronic lockers that allows the delivery people to put each package in a locker, and it automatically sends a passcode to the resident that says, hey, you've got a package in locker number 27, and here's the code to unlock it. She's just done great. She got a little over $1 million, I think, from a combination of family and Tech Coast Angels, and then some subsequent debt financing that's helped her really grow the business well. But the point was that she moved it along pretty far before she really got into serious conversation with investors. And Laurie's kind of the heroine of my book. Lauries Mantra, I just love it. She's a case study in the book also, by the way. But Her mantra is, I can solve any problem. I just need to find the people who can help me solve it. And that's just such a right attitude. It's the kind of attitude that you really have to make startups work. That's my message. Go out and attract the people and the capital that you need to make your company successful. I'm glad to answer questions if anybody has questions. One question I usually get is, how are angels different from VCs? So I'll answer that even if you didn't ask it. Couple answers. One is, remember, VCs are managing other people's money. So they're really on the hook. I mean, they're going to be very professional. They're going to have a lot of staff to help them with due diligence. They're probably a little more rigorous and risk averse maybe than the average angel. So their standards may be a little higher in some ways. You would sort of expect that. But the other answer I'd give is, you should assume that every investor has the tough standards of a VC. Because eventually, if you're going to be successful, you're probably going to need money from the VCs. So don't say, oh, here's this dummy over here who'll give me $500,000 because he doesn't really understand my business. That's probably a bridge halfway across the river. I mean, it's not going to get you to where you really want to be. The only safe assumption to make, I think, is that any investor you're talking to should have the standards of a venture capital, professional venture capital investor, and you're probably going to have to deal with those guys before you're all done anyway. It'd be pretty rare that $1 or $2 million from a couple angel investors would take a company all the way through to success. It does happen. I mean, it happens with app companies, maybe, and some software companies. I mean, there are some kind of companies that are not particularly capital intensive. But most of the companies I've been around, it was going to take at least $5 or $10 million to get them to real success. Yes?
In the two dreams that you mentioned for Novodyne and for
DRC.
DRC,
Yeah.
sorry. Even though they did not have a management team, you stuck with them. You saw something in those dreams, because clearly they weren't attracting other capital, but you were sticking with them. What did you see in them that made you want to stick through with those ideas, those dreams?
Good question. Disruptive, I guess. In the case of DRC, I thought the idea of being able to re-architect a computer on the fly was a disruptive kind of idea. It was, looking back, it might have been ahead of its time a little bit, but it's coming. I mean, that kind of computer architecture is coming. The FPGA companies are kind of driving in that direction. So I probably got ahead of myself a little bit. I didn't have my wizard hat on quite right. And thought it might happen bigger and faster than it did. The other thing that kind of happened there was that we went through a period kind of post.com bubble when the Silicon Valley VCs, we moved this company from Southern California up to Silicon Valley. But the Silicon Valley VCs weren't too excited about doing chip and computer architecture kind of deals for a while there, so we ran into that. So I may have got ahead of myself a little, but I thought it had really disruptive opportunity. In the case of the vaccine, between staph infections and candidiasis infections, those kill something like 80,000 people a year, 40 plus 40, in hospitals. And that's just a huge problem that you just think has to get solved somehow. And I still believe that. I mean, I think it's an enormous market opportunity eventually. Not all the pharmaceutical companies buy that. I mean, the cost of getting a drug through all the clinical trials is really high. And Novodyne has had one successful phase 2 clinical trial, so they're in pretty good shape with the technology. But it's been hard to get the pharmaceutical companies to sign up for the program. But what I saw, and I still see it, is anything you can do to solve a problem for 80,000 people dying every year is a huge thing. The staff side of it is that you probably all know somebody who went in the hospital to have knee replacement or hip surgery and got an infection and had terrible problems. This would be used to vaccinate a patient before they go in for major surgery, a couple weeks before, and it boosts the immune system to protect against MRSA and staph kind of infections. Yes?
So, my name is Bhavan. So, when you go to a VC or angel, generally they like to know, oh, okay, this financial projection is showing, say, in 2 to 3 years, maybe we'll break even or we'll make some money. So when they're asking how much money you're looking for in this round or something, then what should be the right answer to tell them, okay, I need $2 million to get the break even, or I need $500,000 right now to bridge the gap or something like that. So is there any?
Four and a half. I'll repeat the question. So the question is, how do I tell the VCs how much money I need? You know, how do I create a forecast, and how do I figure out, what should I say? What's my answer with how much money I need? It's a really good question, and it's one that a lot of companies don't answer properly. The version of it that I get a lot of time is, gee, I put together my $100 million forecast and everybody said it was way too aggressive. You need to be more conservative. So we cut it back to 30. And then everybody said, that's too conservative. You're not being aggressive enough. You know, what am I supposed to do? Well, what you're supposed to do is go out and do your homework and put together the most realistic, defensible projection you can. So it starts with a market forecast, you know, a revenue projection. I'll distinguish. I mean, first you got to go out and take a hard look at the market and figure out how many customers there might be for your product. But there's no shortcut. I mean, there are different ways you can do that usually. You don't necessarily have to go buy $20,000 market studies. I mean, you can, the internet is just a fantastic tool for trying to figure out how many customers there might be for a product. But you put together the best possible market forecast that you can, make reasonable, defensible, plausible assumptions about what people are going to be willing to pay for the product and how it compares to competition and how well it solves the problem and those kinds of things. So you put together probably a 5-year financial projection, and now you start to think through carefully, well, what's it going to take to do that? You know, so now you're building a spreadsheet that says, well, if I'm going to have $2 million in sales in my 3rd year, I'm going to have this many salespeople, I'm going to have this many engineers and support people. But again, there's no shortcut. I mean, you just have to think it through as realistically as possible. And you know, the VCs will, any investor will always question, but you really have to be able to defend the numbers and put together a good case. I mean, can you do a case and then say, well, it could be plus 10% or minus 10%? Sure, nobody expects you, this is where the corporate planning background comes in. Nobody expects you to have that wizard hat on and to have, one of my other props is a little crystal ball that says, I was hoping you'd ask me that. Nobody expects you to have a crystal ball or be able to project exactly the right answers. But people can tell if you're just guessing or just making it up, or if you haven't built enough detail into your expenses. I mean, the mistake that most startups make is that they overestimate their revenues and they underestimate their expenses. And there's a problem with that. If you haven't thought this through, get a pencil and paper and do a little arithmetic. If you're forecasting, I'm not going to try and do the math. There's an example in the book. But if you're forecasting revenues at some level and expenses at a level, so you have this much profit, what happens if revenues are 20% below and expenses are 20% above? You know, do the math. I mean, the problem, and that's exactly what happens to a lot of companies. When you're taking the difference between two numbers, you know, profit equals gross margin minus expenses, when you're doing that kind of thing, if the revenue number is smaller and the expense number is bigger, pretty soon you get upside down and you're losing money and it's not working. The companies I'm involved with, I usually scrub and rescrub the expenses. You know, the problem with the expenses is it's hard to think of everything. You just don't think of all the things that are going to have to be done. You know, and you get partway down the path, and then you say, "Oh no, we're going to need somebody who can maintain this product in Orlando." We never thought of that. Well, you got to try and anticipate those kinds of things. And the other thing that happens is revenues never build as fast as you think they're going to, because salespeople aren't as productive as you think they're going to be, and they don't come on board as fast as you think they're going to be. So it's kind of natural tendency for to over-project revenues and under-project expenses, and that's a huge mistake. Yes?
How do you deal with a crazy genius inventor who thinks he also knows how to run a company?
Who thinks he knows how to raise his own company?
No, to run his own company.
Who wants to? Yeah, well, I'm not here to say there will never be another Bill Gates or another Steve Jobs. I mean, there will be. You can name a few. You know, there's Gates, Jobs, Hewitt and Packard, Zuckerberg. Quick, name 5 more.
Elon
Musk. 5 more. Yeah, I mean, the world isn't full of them, right? So it's just the odds. That's all. I mean, if that's what you really want to do, go for it. But be realistic about it and know that you're competing against people who have a lot of background and experience. But that, again, it's not to say you shouldn't try it. I mean, if you believe you've got what it takes to pull it off and make it happen, that's great. It's probably true, I've seen a little writing about this, it's probably true that the successful companies that are still being led by their founders, I mean, include Steve Jobs if he was still around, and Gates, Zuckerberg, and some of those other guys, that the ones that were successful were probably more successful than the average Silicon Valley startup with a track record CEO and management team. I think that's probably true. The question is, what are the odds? You know, how many of them have there been? Yes?
In the early stages of a startup, what do you think the best way to deal with the competition, like aggressive competition? Like you start yourself, like for example, a project, and you try to example, like with someone in the market that is doing the same as yours with a bigger value, they have better management, and they're ready in the market, and you're just kind of that small venture just going into the market. So what are the best ways?
Question is, if you're a small startup and you're just entering the market and there's big companies out there in your space, how do you compete with that? It's a great question, and it's a question that all startups ought to answer. One of the little benefits of my strategic planning career was that I took a short course from a guy named Michael Porter, who wrote a book. He's written several books on competitive strategy. I see some of you nodding. If you don't know the Michael Porter books, go get one. The classic is probably Competitive Strategy. I think that's the title of it. That would have been written in the 80s, probably, or maybe late 70s, early 80s. But Michael Porter he's a Harvard professor. He's kind of the guru of competitive strategy. And one thing that every company ought to have is a competitive strategy. He really lays out a formula for how you look at an industry and analyze the different factors that go into competitive strategy. Who are the buyers? Who are the current vendors? What raw materials are required? Who's providing those? I mean, what's the dynamic of competition within an industry? And you really shouldn't go into a competitive situation like that unless you have a really good answer to the question, how much better is your product? Now, listen carefully. How much better? That means you've got a way to quantify how much better. You know, how many megatons, how many dollars, how many inches, how many microns? You know, what's your metric? But how much better is your product than what's out there? And most investors aren't going to care about 10% better, 20% better, 30% better. They might care about twice as good, 3 times as good, 4 times as good. It's got to be substantial. Next question is, how do you know you can sustain that over a 5 or 10 year period of time? Because it's not enough. One of the things that happens, especially in the computer business, is that you know the little story about you can tell the pioneers, they're the guys with the arrows in their back. It's easy for little startup companies to grab a hold of the newest thing in technology and cobble it together into a product and jump out into the marketplace. But if they don't have really sustainable competitive advantage, then the big guys are kind of come along 3 years, 4 years, 5 years later and just mop them up. And there's patterns of that. It happens over and over and over and over. So if you're going to jump into a competitive space like that, you have to really understand how much better your product is, how you're going to sustain that advantage, and is it enough better? If you're taking notes, write down enough better that customers will buy it. You know, that instead of buying from IBM, they'll buy your funny-looking thing because they're convinced that it's substantially better than anything else they can get. Did I answer your question? Yeah, I mean, competitive strategy is hard. Go read one of the Porter books. There was a question over here.
Yeah, I got a patent in 2010, and I didn't realize it was going to take me 8 years to, make a marketable product from a patent. If you have it, man, they say it's good to have a patent, but if you have so much time on it, does it make a difference to an investor? I mean, if the patent's already 8 years down the road.
It's kind of yes and no, I think would be my answer. I mean, it's still got life in it. Is it a 22-year? 20. So it's still got 12 to go or something like that. That's okay. That might be all right. I guess the other thing you might look at is, are there some other things you can do around that patent? I mean, the patent lawyers talk about building fences around patents and stuff like that. So there may be some updates and some new filings that can be had. I don't think you're dead in the water just because your patent's 8 years old. I don't think that necessarily kills it for you. But the other thing you can do is, I'm involved with one company right now that's got that problem kind of worse than you do. But sometimes there's a lot of trade secrets and other things you can do. One company had a thing that their product actually got baked in an oven, and by the time it was all done and came out of the oven, there's no way you could go reverse engineer it. There was no way you could sort of figure out how it had been built. You don't need a patent if you have that kind of protection, and some companies do.
Yeah, one of the things that struck me was your original picture of you on the telephone. And it really struck me because this audience has people that are just in college all the way and have never used a telephone. Can you help me understand what are the generational things that you're looking for in either the CEO team or the venture capital guys, or the venture capital guys? What are their attitudes on a generational basis? Are they, as a perception, only the baby boomers control all the money, and millennials don't control the money? Can you help me understand generational?
Yeah, I'm not sure I have a good answer to that. It was a great question. I mean, it's a very topical. Did everybody hear the question? A couple months ago, Barbara was explaining to one of our granddaughters how she's got a stash of 33 1/3 record albums, you know, stuff from the Beatles and I don't know, who's the polka guy and that kind of stuff. And Lauren, who at that time was probably 11, looked at her and said, "Nanny, what's a record?" And my other story about that is we walked past a little group of kids that are probably 3, 4 years old, and I heard one of the 4-year-olds say, "What was that password again?" It's a different world, and I'm not sure I have a good answer. I mean, my guess is that the real top venture capital firms, the ones I mentioned before, are probably like me, where they're kind of stuck in the old technology a little bit. I mean, my eyes glaze over when people start talking blockchain, and some of the app technologies that people come with, you know, where you're only swipe away from marital bliss, huh? And,
your corporate ladder, you know, the right CEO.
yeah.
Very steady progression, and you were fortunate enough to be in an era where that was possible. I know my daughter, who's going to go to college this year, in fall, I don't think she'll have that same luxury of a progression with one company. It'll be all over the field because the world's changing so fast.
For better or for worse, I mean, one way I see, well, there are a couple ways I see this. But some years ago, I don't know, probably 8 or 10 years ago, I was with some investors from Australia. They were angel investors from Australia. And they were saying, you know, we're just making tons of money on our investments. We're getting out in 2 or 3 years, and we never have to put in more than $1 million. And I'm sitting there scratching my head saying, how's this working? And finally, kind of halfway through dinner, I looked at the guy, I said, "You're doing software deals, aren't you?" He said, "Yeah, that's all we do. So it's little software packages." And now it's kind of escalated to apps. I mean, the app business is interesting. I mean, you can get in cheap, you can get in fast, you can get in quick. But what percentage of them are successful? I mean, that's one reason that I haven't got too far down that path. I suspect there are VCs, young guys up in Silicon Valley with some of those top firms. They're probably guys who graduated from Stanford 2 years ago who have a pretty good handle on what works. It's really hard to know, I think, what's going to work, especially in the internet world. And I keep asking myself, does anybody really understand this? I mean, is anybody smart enough to figure out that a Facebook is going to work or that Amazon is going to work? You know, there are some pretty good examples, some pretty good successes, but there's also an awful lot of competition, and it's pretty easy to get into some of those things. The entry costs are pretty low. So I kind of wonder what the overall rate of success is. I hope I addressed your question. Well, the question is, how many points do you get for social impact? And I'd say with the traditional VCs, probably not a lot. I mean, they won't hold it against you, but it's hard to monetize it. So they're looking pretty hardcore at financial returns. I mean, I don't think they would be opposed to getting financial returns in a venture that has a very positive social impact. I don't think anybody would have any problem with that. Kleiner Perkins at one time had quite a major effort to invest in green kinds of companies. I think they backed away from that. I mean, because they were finding out that it was kind of hard to make a profit doing that. I guess you could look at the healthcare investments that get made. There are a number of venture capital firms that specialize in healthcare kind of deals. So I guess that's a situation where they're thinking there's a humanitarian positive side.
Wondering if companies like Uber that have had some real significant implications based on their reputation, if that's starting to just create differently, or people are thinking about how does the social impact potentially sort of have a longer range of impact in how it's ran there.
I'm not aware that there are VC firms that are, I mean, there probably are some social impact funds out there, but most of VCs are focused on technology. All they really, I shouldn't say it that way, but all they really care about is proprietary technology and leveraging that. I mean, that's really what the VCs, that's why it started with computer chips and that kind of stuff up in Silicon Valley, because you can get what Michael Porter calls sustainable, unfair, competitive advantage. You know, you get your patents, you build a little portfolio of patents, and now you own your space for 20 years or something like that. Nobody can really compete with you, so now you go out and leverage that, and you're very profitable because you've got this unfair competitive advantage against your competition. Yes, let's see, yeah. Yeah, competitive advantage doesn't have to be about product necessarily. I mean, I kind of gave that as an example. But it can also be business model or approach to things. I mean, look what Michael Dell did. I mean, that wasn't product as much as it was sort of changing the distribution scheme, that whole approach. Messaging, important, sure. But I don't know, maybe, I mean, it really is important to send your messages clearly and effectively. There's no question about that. But I'm not sure that any amount of messaging would make up for a bad idea or a bad infrastructure. I'm not sure I'm addressing what's on your mind.
Well, you seem to really locate the differentiator in product, and of course you can't just put lipstick on a pig, right? And then you have PR problems, and if you're perceived in the industry as being a social ill, that's problematic for your message. I just wondered if it was broader than just a product differentiator. It sounds like it is.
Say more. Give me an example.
Sorry.
Give an example.
Yeah, well, I don't know that the best product always wins, I guess. It seems like story is a really important part of that. Your whole approach to go-to-market is really important. But maybe you would disagree with that.
If I was invested in what I thought was the second best product, I'd probably get my money back and go invest in what I thought was the first best product. And if they weren't messaging well, I'd find somebody who can help them message well. I mean, you're sort of touching on another issue here. Again, the book touches on it a little bit. Do investors invest in ideas or in people? And you'll hear some investors say, "Oh, all I care about is the people. You know, if I have a good team of people, I'll invest in those people every time because they'll come up with the best ideas." Well, that's not me. I'm the other way. I would rather invest in the best product, a really good idea, and my theory is if I don't have the best people, I can go find them, like Laurie. You know, I can solve any problem. I just have to find the people who can help me solve it. Yeah. So messaging is a fixable problem, I guess, in my experience. Yeah.
So most of your talk discussed how startups attract people and capital. But what advice do you have for a startup that already has its core team and already has enough capital to move on? Like I know you can't say a specific percentage of how much to allocate towards, for example, marketing, how much towards product development. But what type of things do you think about
I think the two parts. So the question is, we've got our team, we got our money. How do we figure out the best thing to do? Two parts to it, I guess. One is, I think you really need to sort of start by saying, well, what do we need to accomplish? You know, what are the most important things for us to do here? And that's just a function of where you are. I mean, you know, if you have you introduced your product to the marketplace, or is that still in front of you? I mean, you make a list. You know, make a list of the 10 most important things to do, and now start building your spreadsheet of expenses and saying, you know, what resources do we need to get that done? What's it going to cost us? How do we build up our expenses? Can we do what we want to do within the budgets we have? I don't know how else to approach it except along those kind of lines. I mean, one question you ought to be able to answer to 3 decimal places is, how long will our money last us? And the answer probably ought to be 18 months or something like that. If it's less than 18 months, a couple things happen. One is you may not have enough to achieve some really major milestones that would allow you to go out and raise more money. And the other is you may not have enough in reserve, and you may not have enough time to go out and raise money, because it can take 12 months to go out and raise the next round of money. So it's a good idea to have at least 18 months worth of money in the bank, and make sure that it's enough to allow you to get through the next couple major milestones. I think I've ignored some questions from over here. Yeah.
So to piggyback off of your investing in money, and people are investing in products. So if you've got a team, you've got a great idea, and yet, you know, it's so fluid in terms of the generation thing, where people come and go within companies. Do you help the companies that you invest in to plug in the holes when somebody leaves, or somebody is part of this startup? Because you've got to obviously continue down their path. Not many people have a complete product, everything's done, and all they need is money from that point.
I'm not sure I've seen the situation you're talking about. Well, a company is kind of a revolving door of people, I guess. How do you deal with that? Yeah.
Where the concern, you know, you've got these startup people, and what if you lose somebody key? I guess that's.
Oh, what if you lose a key person from a startup? Yeah. I don't have a really good answer to that. I mean, go find a better one, I guess. Yeah, or figure out how to not lose them in the first place. I don't have a good answer to that question. I mean, that's a threat to startups, and that is one of the things that the VCs are very concerned about. I mean, like in the DRC example I gave, the VCs, part of the strategy that the larger VC firms would follow would be to sort of build a backup technical team around the founders, so that you've got a key man there. I mean, if he disappears, you've got nothing. So how do you back that up? I mean, that's probably the best answer I could get.
Last question. So as you are saying correctly, probably the 18 months of reserve we have in the bank. So, but it is so difficult to have that much money laying in the bank. Somebody might, generally, based on my experience, it is so difficult to keep that money in the bank, because you just keep spending, and when you have money, you wanted to see the opportunity, spend it there. That kind of things is happening or popping up. Oh, okay, new market is coming up for my own product, so I have to spend the money, hire new resources. So is it that the right approach, or whatever I have planned for things, I have to stick with that?
Question is, what's going to keep me from spending my 18 months worth of money? Discipline.
Yeah.
Discipline, focus. Don't keep coming up with new ideas. That's one thing. If you had a venture capitalist sitting on your board, you're going to hear the word focus 29 times per hour. Focus, 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 focus. You know, do one thing, do it well, make it work.
Where does one find mentors and advisors?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And so how do I find mentors? It's a really tricky question because there's a gazillion people. How many people would like to be this guy's mentor? Hands? Well, the world is full of people who want to be mentors. I mean, there's mentors and job coaches and lots of help. And your challenge is, how do I figure out who to listen to? You know, who do I listen to? And I don't really know how to answer that question other than, you know, listen to the people who have the most experience. You know, find people who have done it before, who not necessarily successfully. You know, maybe they've succeeded, maybe they've failed, but they've kind of been there and done that, and they've got some scars to show for it. That's the ultimate test I can think of. I mean, another thing to do is one of the lessons here is be very careful about vetting the people that you work with, sort of check them out. I mean, I can't tell you how many companies I've seen burn through their startup capital because they went to 3 or 4 completely different web developers, didn't check them out, didn't ask any questions, didn't look at any previous work that they had done, just believed that they could get the work done, spent $50,000 to get a website, and then got nothing. So you have to really do some reference checking. You know, who have you helped in the past? You know, who can I talk to? I mean, it's not an easy question, and there's no easy answer. But you have to be smart about whether the person you're talking to has really been there and had the kind of experience that would help you in your situation. Another thing you could do, if you're in a particular industry, is go to some of the leaders in your space and talk to them. You know, go talk to CEOs of some companies or some top-level people and say, hey, who should I be talking to? Who can help me out here? You know, who knows this space? I hope that helps a little bit. It's a very tricky question. Juan.
Would you like to take one more question?
I'll take one more question. This will be the loudest question.
So my name is Vishnath, and Fred, first of all, I would like to thank you for excellent presentation and a lot of wisdom.
Thank you. Thanks.
So my question is, we talked about funding from VCs and angel investors, but think of a situation of a company which already got the clients and is on the some company.
Already what?
Hypothetical. A company is having clients, already having clients, a startup having clients, and organically is going to achieve, get its break-even very soon. Should they go for VCs for some exponential growth, or they should try to grow organically and try to get some bank loans? What would you recommend?
I may be hearing wrong, but when you say the company already has clients,
yes,
that suggests to me that it's a service business?
In the product company. So company having customers, users, right? So product company.
But so it'd be okay to say they have customers.
Customers.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. I mean, clients to me sounds like an insurance salesman or some kind of a service business. So the company has a product. Mm-hmm. It's got customers. It's doing business. So let me ask you that. So you've proven that you can build the product. You've proven that you can make the product for a reasonable cost. Mm-hmm. You've proven that people will buy it. You've proven that they're happy because you're getting feedback from the customers. I'm going through the stepping stones here with a little intent because part of dealing with investors is reducing the risk. And what I did was just eliminate almost all the risk for investors. They don't have to take the risk of will the product work? They don't have to take the risk of can we make it? They don't have to take the risk of will it work and will it solve the problem. They don't have to take the risk of will anybody buy it. They don't have to take the risk of will they pay the price. So all that's really left is, can we scale this up into a multinational business? That's the kind of deal investors ought to be happy with.
Now should entrepreneur go to VCs at this stage, or should just go to bank and try to get the loans, or maybe try to get more clients? And
banks have a nasty habit of giving money to people who don't need it. If you can go to the bank and get a receivables loan or something like that, that's probably a good thing to do. It's probably cheaper money. Some of the banks will do that. Depends on how far along you are and what your revenue levels are and what your accounts receivable situation is. But sometimes they'll lend against your accounts receivable. So that might be a conversation worth having with the banks. But if the only risk is the risk of scaling the business up, that might be something that the venture capitalists would be invested in. What's the potential? What's the best story 5 years from now? What might your revenues be?
5 years from now?
Yeah.
Around 50 million.
How much?
50 million.
50?
Yeah, 50.
Well, that might be you may be sort of in between the venture capitalists and the angels. I mean, I think the real answer is probably talk to everybody. Okay. Explore all your options and hope that one of them works.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.